Alright, so I'm going to read Persephone by D. Streatfeild. I'm going to just start reading the introduction. It's from 1959, and it says, "A study of two worlds is an exploration into the inner world of man, attributed to be the source of major designs expressed in our conscious, creative existence. The author presents an exciting new concept of literary criticism dealing with the unconscious symbolism behind such works as Faulkner's Sanctuary, Chase's No Orchids for Miss Blandish, and Thurber's The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. It is a most fascinating, superbly conducted literary adventure leading to another level of reality and relating myth, dream, and fantasy to the accomplishments of the artist in his drive for realization. The author views literature as being more than a skillful, sensitive grouping of words and storytelling, and connects man's artistic achievements with earlier traditions and periods of development, thus opening fountains of experience and challenge which for centuries have been obscured. The interaction of the personal or particular and the universal parts of the mind is one of the principal themes of this book. To support his thesis, the author shows the underlying basic relationship of the myth of Persephone and other persisting myths to outstanding literary and artistic works which recur throughout history in too great frequency to permit relegation only to the category of chance. In addition to the provocative parallels revealed in the study of myth and literature, the author meticulously reviews the nature of these expressions and deduces that except for superficial temporal alterations, the motivational drives and structural designs are similar. He approaches this line of inquiry as a modern, highly developed writer who critically applies the scientific knowledge of our times to his survey, but does not fall victim to denying the imagination and openness their proper place in any serious study. The philosophy of the author, though he in no way openly asserts it, shows an amazing relationship to Vedantic, Buddhistic, and present-day existential thinking. Sir Herbert Reed says, "It compels us to recognize the profound significance of the fantasies through which millions of people seek to escape from their dreary actualities of their environment." And so, the introduction is interesting. It says, "It is often helpful to know how a book came to be written. It is therefore worth explaining that the present study is connected with a work of fiction, to the writing of which I devoted my leisure over a period of years, and which I subsequently abandoned. Several years later, reading Hadley Chase's No Orchids for Miss Blandish, I came upon an episode which corresponded with a passage in my own story in a manner so extraordinarily close that it was impossible to pass the resemblance over as a coincidence. The episode concerned was briefly as follows. In No Orchids, Miss Blandish has been kidnapped by gangsters, but is rescued by a rival gangster who takes her to his flat, intending to return her to her father, from whom he hopes for a reward. She, however, unaccountably objects to being restored to him. She hits her rescuer over the head with a chair, tears the telephone cable from its connection, locks the door and throws the key out the window. She insists on the inevitability of recapture by Slim Grisson, her kidnapper and ravisher, and he duly arrives, knifes his rival, and asserts his connubial rights on the spot. In my own story, the hero, returning to his rooms, finds a girl to whom he had started to make love, waiting for him outside the door. He had earlier discovered that this girl was the mistress of his superior, a man in an influential official position, who also holds him in his power in another connection, and had for that reason decided to have no more to do with her. She, however, has fallen in love with him and is determined to keep him. She therefore insinuates herself into the flat and refuses to leave. When he threatens to have her removed by the police and goes to the telephone, there is a scuffle, which ends in her tearing the telephone cable from its connection and the couple end in one another's arms. At first sight, the parallelism may seem slight enough, being confined to the striking but trivial elements of the struggle and the tearing of the telephone cable from the wall. But in addition to these, there were certain resemblances, again superficial but nonetheless striking, between my hero and Slim Grissom. The former, for instance, also, although in quite another connection, kills with a knife, and although he is seen in a completely different light, and in my story plays an entirely different role, he possessed certain personal idiosyncrasies which were reminiscent of Slim. These were enough to make a profound impression on me. I received the impression that in Hadley Chase's rendering of the scene I was recognizing something that I had seen before. It was rather as though I had witnessed an isolated scene from a play in an unknown language, had attempted afterwards to reconstruct the plot of the story of which this scene formed a part, and was now reading another attempted reconstruction by somebody in a like position. I felt, in short, a strong conviction that Hadley Chase and I had, as it were, witnessed the same vision, or dreamed the same dream, and had each attempted to give an account of it as he understood it, each being under the necessity of adapting it to some extent to the requirements of his story. This reaction was, of course, a purely subjective matter. I am not attempting to found any hypothesis on it, but relate it simply because it was in fact the starting point of this study, and because it introduces the main thesis that I shall attempt to establish on the basis of other, more objective evidence. The force of the impact which this experience made on me can perhaps only be fully appreciated by somebody who has attempted to write fiction. He will know how the writer, turning his eyes inwards, conjures up characters and situations, believing that he has created them, how he wrestles with these products of the free fantasy, explaining and rationalizing them, fitting them into the overall plan of the story, and as he does so, finding out more about them, or as he believes, inventing characteristics, backgrounds, thoughts, and purposes for them. He is intimately aware of how each episode arose, and how it was shaped and fitted into the plot, and the considerations which led to the choice of each detail, and of the way in which vague and nebulous forms were progressively clarified, filled in, and built up into the finished product. The whole process seems such a private and personal matter, that the discovery that the experience has been shared, that the details which he believed that he had evolved and worked out for himself must in fact have been objectively present, though unrecognized from the start, for they had already been seen by somebody else, comes as a profound shock. For although it seems obvious to us that if two people watch the same play at the theater, they will see and hear the same things, we believe that what goes on inside our heads is strictly private. This privacy of thought, indeed, is one of our most prized possessions, and it is always with something of a shock, generally accompanied by slight feelings of resentment, that we discover that somebody else has read our thoughts. Yet here I was confronted by convincing evidence that what I had discovered inside my head had been equally accessible to somebody else. The experience led me to embark on an analysis of No Orchids from a symbolical viewpoint, and in the process I perceived that the parallelism between the episodes related above was by no means so superficial as it appeared at first sight. The rule for this kind of analysis is to ignore the explanations and rationalizations provided by the writer, and to concentrate on what actually happened and on the outcome. One must regard the characters in the drama as independent, autonomous persons, with their own motives. Evidence confirming that this is in fact the case will be adduced in due course. One must assume that the writer may not have fully understood these motives, or may have distorted or misrepresented them to some extent in obedience to the requirements of his plot, and must attempt to reconstruct them from the actions related. If we proceed on these lines, it becomes apparent that the two episodes reveal the following common basic elements. A. The girl is where she ought not to be, i.e., she belongs to a principle of authority from whose control she has been removed or has escaped. B. This has occurred in connection with her love for a man who is at odds with and is fundamentally hostile to the principle of authority. In C, she is alone with a man in a closed room. D, when an attempt is made to establish communication with the principle of authority, which would break up the love affair, she frustrates it. And E, the forbidden union of the lovers is consummated. In my story, the girl goes to her lover of her own free will, whereas Miss Blandish is represented as being taken by force against her will, but her behavior on this occasion reveals clearly enough that her real motive was no different, namely the consummation of her love for the rebel against authority. That then was the true basis of the inner world drama which Hadley Chase and I had both witnessed, in which we both attempted to interpret according to our respective and very different viewpoints. The perspicacious reader may already discern some of its implications, as well as some parallels with greater and better known versions of the theme. An attempt will be made to elucidate some of them in the following chapters. For the moment, we must postpone any attempt at interpretation, taking this opportunity merely to state the basic thesis which will be our purpose to establish in the course of this study. This is that there exists an inner world which lies outside our personal minds, and in which there are contained in exactly the same way as our bodies are contained in the outer world revealed by the senses. The inner world is no less subjective than the outer, i.e., in certain respects it is the same for all observers, although their particular view of it and their individual interpretations of what they perceive in it must necessarily vary to some extent, exactly as the particular views and interpretations made by individuals of certain aspects of the outer world vary. A host of objections will inevitably spring up in the mind of the average reader in face of this pronouncement, reminiscent as it is of the woolly theories of many spiritualists, occultists, and the like. I can only ask him to approach my attempt to establish it with an open mind, for it is not a regurgitation of hazy subjective emotions, but a serious attempt to suggest a system of reference which may help us to understand some of the problems of our times. It is also written in full awareness of the importance of the problems of the outer world, from which we derive our daily bread. One of my principal themes, indeed, is the necessity of strict discrimination between these two worlds. But this is only possible if we have some understanding of the nature of the inner. The basic patterns on which the two are constituted, and the laws which govern them, are fundamentally different. Failure to recognize this fact and to take sufficient account of the laws of the inner world often leads to misunderstandings and false valuations which have a disastrous effect on our outer world life. I shall attempt to show that the inner world is real, no more but also no less real than the outer. Inner world factors acting according to their own laws and not to those of the outer world affect our minds, and our minds determine our actions. That perhaps is obvious, but the belief is commonly held today that our minds are no more than the mirrors of the outer world, and possess no inherent, independent, and autonomous contents of their own. Hence, we believe that all we need to do in order to make the best of life is to concentrate on the laws of the outer world. Once they are fully understood, we believe, we cannot go wrong, because we shall be able to adapt ourselves perfectly to our environment. We overlook the fact that we have an inner as well as an outer environment, and that we must adapt ourselves to the former no less than to the latter. When factors deriving from our inner environment force themselves on our attention, we are impatient with them and attempt to explain them away in outer world terms, or we brush them aside as mere atavisms, vestigial remnants of our less enlightened past, which can be relied upon to melt away and disappear in due course when subjected to the healthy air of outer world understanding. We either insist that the inner world is not real and is therefore unworthy of attention, or else we attempt to treat it as a subordinate department of the outer. This is a very dangerous tendency, for to ignore and neglect the unalterable patterns of the mind is no less disastrous than to ignore and neglect outer world facts. Inner world factors, exactly like those of the outer world, will assert themselves whether we recognize and accept them or not. And if we refuse to recognize and accept them, the consequences will be no less serious than those which ensue from ignoring or misunderstanding the forces of the outer world. For my obvious dependence on the system of Jung, and for my constant references to and quotations from his work, I make no apology. For many years, I have found his ideas not only an unfailing source of inspiration and help in personal life, but also the key which makes all human behavior intelligible. This is undoubtedly due to an individual orientation which the reader may not share, and I shall presently explain my personal position in this matter. If the reader cannot accept this basic approach to life, for which I do not claim any absolute or exclusive validity, there is nothing to be done. Even if he allows himself to be convinced by the arguments, the system will remain something alien which he cannot assimilate to his conception of the meaning of life, and he will not benefit from it. I believe, however, that there are many people in the world today who might benefit greatly from a better understanding of Jung's system if they were not initially prejudiced against it. A not uncommon viewpoint on this matter is one which I recently saw explicitly stated, namely that Freud was the scientist of the modern psychological movement, whereas Jung's principal contribution to it was the restoration of the irrational element of soul to modern thinking. The danger in this sweeping generalization is that today the mere word science enjoys such enormous prestige that people are apt to regard it as tantamount to truth. If they do make any reservation in this respect, it is generally only to the effect that science is not concerned with values. In order to form a basis for our judgments on what is good, beautiful, and the like, we must, they admit, look elsewhere. But where understanding is concerned, and above all in practical matters, science is regarded as infallible. Psychology is regarded nowadays as a branch of practical medicine, and medicine is a science. Hence, the belief that Freud's system is essentially scientific, whereas Jung's is primarily concerned with the irrational, denotes a strong bias against the latter. Jung's system, it implies, is all very well as an academic curiosity. He has interesting things to say about the symbolism of myths, the meaning of alchemy, and the like, but when it comes to practical matters, we must turn to Freud. It is even a common affectation among people of a scientific turn of mind to say that they do not understand what Jung is talking about. In a later chapter, we shall find a scientist complacently asserting that he cannot begin to understand what philosophers are talking about, and then advancing his own views on philosophical questions, revealing in the process considerable ignorance and very inadequate reflection. The epitome of this attitude is embodied in the dictum of some writers, some writer quoted by Maud Bodkin, to the effect that the Zurich school only offers a fresh bunch of superstitions. This gentleman has at least the candor to say openly what the others politely infer. Maud Bodkin in Archetypal Patterns in Poetry. But the essence of what we loosely call science is a discipline or a general method, which demands that hypotheses be set up on the basis of observation of the outer world, and then established by experiments which can be repeated at any time. The scientific experiment is a contrived demonstration whereby it can be established whether the hypothesis is true or false, and every stage of the procedure, as well as the materials used, must be capable of exact control and definition by the experimenter. It is at once obvious that the discipline can only be applied to the field of psychology in a very limited sphere, for the mind cannot be segregated from its environment in a test tube and subjected to influences which can be exactly controlled and defined by the psychologist. Freudians, in fact, can no more devise a set experiment to demonstrate the existence and properties of the Oedipus complex than Jungians can do the same for the collective unconscious. In this sense, then, and as every scientist will admit, it is the essential sense of the concept of science as generally understood. There are no grounds for maintaining that the system of Freud is any more scientific than that of Jung. Nevertheless, the prejudice against Jung's system is prevalent. I shall attempt to elucidate the reasons for this in the following chapters, and in the meanwhile ask the reader to approach the problem with an open mind, for it may well be that any reluctance or aversion which he may feel towards accepting some of the features of Jung's system are based on an unadmitted prejudice. He must above all resist the temptation of rejecting ideas out of hand because they are of an unfamiliar type. Disguising this fear of the unfamiliar from himself under the cover of some such evasion as that he does not understand, he will find it quite possible to understand if he is prepared to make the necessary effort. And only then will he be in a position to reach a sound and balanced judgment on the question of whether he agrees or not. But although it is not possible to apply the scientific method to psychology in the precise form in which it is applied in the more familiar fields of chemistry, physics, and biology, if we can adopt a somewhat wider definition of the word science, we can justifiably claim that it is possible to approach the study of psychology in a scientific spirit. If we define a science as a coherent and consistent system of understanding in a particular field of experience, then psychology, the study of the mind or soul, can perfectly well qualify as a science. In order that it may so qualify, however, we must evolve an acceptable terminology in which to define the subject matter of our enquiries, and it is in this that our greatest difficulty lies, for the systematic study of the inner world is still at an elementary stage. The basis and framework of any science consists of the terms which are used in it, for each of which a precise definition has been worked out, so that it is always clear to exactly what any statement refers. The working out, the development, the differentiation, and the precision of these terms actually constitute the science. Scientific advance consists mainly of the introduction of fresh terms with the concomitant definitions which clarify and fix the concepts to which they apply. This is a slow and continuous process. No science is born like Athene, fully armed. Thus, today, the term electricity means virtually nothing to the physicist, because in the context of his subject it might mean almost anything. He will want to know if the term is to be understood as referring to a current or a static charge, a distortion in space represented by a mathematical formula, a free electron, or any of 100 phenomena associated with these things, for each of which he has evolved a clearly circumscribed scientific term. 200 years ago, the word still meant something. It was the mysterious power which caused scraps of paper to adhere to a piece of amber which had been rubbed, and was believed to be a specific property of amber. By modern standards, such a definition is useless, yet its invention was the first step in the development of the whole body of modern theory connected with the subject. One must start somewhere. In the study of the contents and structure of the inner world, therefore, the investigator, still groping in darkness, is compelled to identify such phenomena as he can and give them a name by which they can be provisionally fixed and recognized. There can be no doubt whatever the later investigators will find many of these terms inaccurate, unsatisfactory, or even misleading, and will introduce a richer, more highly developed terminology to take their place. Nevertheless, they will offer posterity a point of departure, even if it be only something to depart from. Even the theories of phlogiston, or of the corpuscular nature of light, had their value in the clarification to which their refutation gave rise, for, as Socrates demonstrated, the reductio ad absurdum of a false hypothesis is an important step towards the establishment of a true one. In this embryo science, therefore, we must be content, for the time being, to accept much inaccuracy and uncertainty, in the absence of an accurate terminology and of closely defined standards with which to compare individual phenomena. It must inevitably happen that we are sometimes uncertain exactly what we are talking about. When we believe that we have isolated an image or entity of the mind, we suddenly find it mysteriously changing its attributes, merging into another image or disappearing altogether. The difficulty may be that we are in reality concerned with two separate entities or tendencies merged in a combination in which we are unable to discriminate between them, in much the same way as the physical scientists of last century were unable to distinguish between the various isotopic forms of the same element. Or it may be that the entity with which we are concerned, being a living process, does in fact change its form as it develops, as the caterpillar changes into the butterfly. Or again, its aspect may depend entirely on the viewpoint from which we are considering it. All these matters must be taken into account, and for the time being, we simply have not collected enough material or devoted enough consideration to the subject to allow us to advance very far. Any attempt at over-precise definition, therefore, is liable to defeat its own ends. The images of the mind are like fishes, slippery things. Until we have devised efficient instruments of thought with which to lay hold of them and retain them in the light while we undertake a detailed examination of their anatomy and behavior, they are apt to slide back into the dark waters of the unconscious before we have gotten very far, and after such an experience they are apt to become shy and hide themselves in the depths. It is better for the time being to coax them to the surface and to make what observations we can without disturbing them. The alternative to this tentative and admittedly provisional approach to the subject is to attempt to reduce everything, in the Freudian manner, to concrete outer world terms, under the impression that we then know exactly what we are talking about. When, for instance, we discern a mental image of the male sex which is associated with authority, we name it the father image, and seek to prove that it must be derived from the relationship of the infant to its concrete personal father, a matter which everybody can easily grasp without going to the trouble of mastering unfamiliar concepts and developing a new mode of thought. This is what Jung describes as the reductive tendency of the Freudian system, because it seeks to reduce mental phenomena to the status of mere reflections of physical facts in concrete situations. It is retrogressive and leads nowhere. I believe that one of the most important causes of the prejudice against Jung's teaching is that it demands the acceptance of the existence or reality of entities of an unfamiliar nature, such as the collective unconscious and the archetypes. The meaning of the terms existence and reality is a difficult question, and in order to understand and accept the implications of Jung's system, and of the inner world generally, it is necessary to have devoted some thought to it. It is a subject to which, not unnaturally, people do not normally devote much attention. They use the terms in a rough and ready colloquial manner, which is adequate for all ordinary purposes, and in consequence, when it is suggested that inner world entities such as the collective unconscious exist and are real, they imagine that they are being asked to believe that these things are of the same nature as tables and chairs, corporeal human beings, and similar objects to which they are accustomed to accord the properties of reality and existence. In the circumstances, it is understandable that they should object. But if the meanings of the terms of reality and existence are analyzed, it will be found that they can be legitimately applied to inner world entities without doing violence to that well-tried system of outer world interpretation which is provided by modern science. It is only a question of making a serious attempt to understand what the new terminology means. The Inquisition was alarmed and angered by Galileo's ideas about gravity because they did not understand what he was talking about. But Galileo himself would almost certainly have been unreceptive to the conception of the curvature of space, and for the same reason. The problem of the nature of reality and existence in its relationship to the theory of two worlds will be examined in the second part of this volume. My hostility to the system of Freud will already have been noted, and it will become progressively more apparent. It is fairly generally known that Jung and Freud parted company owing to an insuperable divergency of views, and some little animosity both between them and their followers inevitably resulted from the breach. In order to forestall any misunderstanding, it will be advisable for me to state at the outset that I have no part in any feud which may exist between the rival schools. I am not a Jungian in the sense that I have no connection with the Zurich school, or indeed with any psychologists. My views on psychology are derived solely from private reading and from the study of the human material with which I have been brought into contact in the course of a life devoted to various pursuits completely unconnected with psychology. Like many people of my generation, I discovered the psychology of the unconscious from the works of Freud at the end of my school days, when they were beginning to become widely known among the lay public. I at once became an enthusiastic adherent of the system, although purely as an intellectual diversion, but after a few years my interest died because, as I realized even then, it led nowhere so far as I was concerned. Soon afterwards, however, my interest in the modern psychological movement was revived by reading Herbert Silberer's Probleme der Mystik und ihrer Symbolik, or Problems of Mysticism and Symbolism, which opened up a new world of thought for me. This work had appeared in 1914, when only the first of Jung's major works, Wandlungen und Symbol der Libido, or The Psychology of the Unconscious, had yet been published, and that time Jung himself had not yet broken away completely from Freud's ideas, and Silberer still accepts them without question. Nevertheless, his approach differs radically from Freud's in that his thinking is not reductive. He does not attempt to explain away all symbolism by reducing it to the status of a distorted representation of the outer world fact, but, on the contrary, he follows it into the world of mind and seeks to discover the nature of that world and the laws which govern its contents, in contrast to those of the outer world. He accepts the inner world as a reality. At the time, of course, I did not fully understand all this, but I can still remember the impression which I received then, some 25 years ago, that here at last was a psychologist who worked upwards and not downwards. Today I should use the term inwards and outwards. Later again I began to read Jung's works, but was not immediately captivated by all his theories. His basic approach seemed to me intrinsically right in the same way as Silberer's did, but to begin with, I rejected a number of his conclusions, which I either could not accommodate to my system of thought at the time, or else could not find substantiated in my own observation of life. It has only been in the course of some 20 years of completely independent thought and observation that I have become convinced that this system, with the addition of a few extensions of my own, does provide an intelligible and acceptable explanation of life as I understand it. I still disagree with it in a few minor points, to which I have alluded in various places in this study, but in the main I have come to accept this system on the basis of my own observation, and it may be added, of some bitter experiences. I regard it as a guide to real life, not as an intellectual diversion. And lastly, deeply though I revere Dr. Jung, who I have never met, and great though my gratitude to him is, I am not his disciple, but I am an independent investigator who has found his theories more helpful than any others. This preference on my part is easily explained on the basis of Jung's system. Freud's thinking is extroverted, whereas Jung's and Silberer's is introverted, and my own tendency is markedly in the latter direction. It is of the essence of Jung's theory of extroversion and introversion that these two attitudes of mind, with the whole system of values and principles to which they give rise, are fundamentally opposed, but that they are nevertheless complementary, that neither is intrinsically better, truer, or in any sense superior to the other. In the first instance, therefore, it might seem that there is not necessarily anything to choose between these two opposing psychological systems. They might represent two views of the same truth as seen from opposite viewpoints. in which case the only balanced and comprehensive view of the subject would be the one which takes account of both. The extrovert's meat is the introvert's poison, and vice versa. Extrovert thinkers, therefore, might be expected to derive most benefit from following Freud's system, while those whose thought is introverted should cleave to Jung's, and they should agree to disagree. This conclusion, however, is open to two objections. In the first place, Jung, by formulating this polarity, may claim to have established a system which transcends it, and in fact, although his tendency remains introverted, and although he reached his impartial standpoint by following an introverted line of thought, he does almost invariably succeed in maintaining his impartiality by having a due regard for the extrovert point of view. It is only very occasionally that introvert prejudices slip past his guard. In this respect, therefore, his system does not seem Catholic or more Catholic and comprehensive than Freud's. And while I know from personal experience that the introverted thinker can learn to understand a great deal about that profoundest enigma for him, the extrovert viewpoint, from a study of the works of Jung, I am convinced that the extroverted thinker will derive no clue concerning the nature of introverted thought from those of Freud. In the second place, the very nature of the subject demands an introverted rather than an extroverted approach. The concretizing, particularizing tendency of extroverted thinking is eminently well suited to the study of, e.g., botany or zoology. Charles Darwin was a typical extrovert thinker, but it is out of place in the investigation of the mind for the latter, although it contains the concrete and particular, is abstract and tends toward the universal in its structure and nature. Hence it seems to me that while nobody can deny the importance of Freud's pioneering work in the study of the psychology of the unconscious, and while a certain number of his basic conclusions remain unchallenged, yet the later developments and even some of the basic tenets of his system are at best one-sided and incomplete, and at worst misleading and retrogressive in the context of the study of the mind. His conception of instinct in particular seems to me entirely fallacious, as I shall attempt to demonstrate, and on that conception a large part of his system rests. Jung's system, on the other hand, seems to me to embrace all that is of fundamental value in Freud's, while at the same time going beyond it to its own sphere and in addition making contributions to thought, the import of which far transcends the limited sphere of medical psychology. I must make it quite clear, however, that I speak without any practical knowledge of psychotherapy. I am convinced from personal experience that Jung's system can be of the greatest assistance to the layman who applies it perseveringly to the treatment of his own psychological difficulties, but I am not in a position to make any pronouncements on the respective merits of the two systems as applied by practitioners to the cure of more serious mental derangements. But this last is surely only a secondary aspect of a psychological system, the ideal function of which is to enable the layman to understand the nature of mind, and thereby to escape the necessity of psychiatric treatment. There are one or two other matters in connection with which the approach adopted in this study runs counter to prevalent forms of thought, and for which it is therefore better to prepare the reader in advance. The first, which may arouse opposition in the minds of those who are unaccustomed to the assumption of an unconscious element in the motivation of almost all human behavior, will arise from the apparently arbitrary manner in which thoughts, feelings, and motivations unknown to the authors are inferred from the contents of their works. The complete and positive acceptance of this viewpoint is perhaps only possible to those who have studied human behavior in its light over a number of years, and in particular have convinced themselves of its applicability to their own minds. Such unconscious contents, like all other material, which is not immediately comprehensible to the conscious mind, are revealed in the first place by the intuitive function in a manner which, by its very nature, is not susceptible of rational explanation. The material thus intuitively produced, however, can subsequently be worked over, analyzed, and rearranged by the process of rational thought, until it can be shown to be either compatible or incompatible with a logically coherent system or world picture, which embraces other material as well. If it proves compatible, if it fits in with what we have already established as incontrovertible, the new idea may be accepted as scientifically valid. The history of the development of the natural sciences abounds in examples of this process. The discoverer gets an idea in the form of a flash of insight, and then proceeds to establish its factual validity by means of patient experimentation and analysis. This process can be applied to the symbolical material contained in a poem in precisely the same way as to the structure of a complex molecule, as revealed by its chemical and physical properties. The only difference lies in the manner in which the material is analyzed and the nature of the standards by comparison with which its properties and correlations are defined. Several centuries of intensive investigation and speculation have been required in order to establish the methods and standards of the physical sciences in their present form. In comparison with them, the sciences of the mind are still in their infancy, and their methods and standards crude, uncertain, and unfamiliar. It is for this reason that it is often harder to accept conclusions derived from purely symbolical or mental material than those deduced from the behavior of physical bodies in accordance with the familiar and established methods of the natural sciences. But it is only necessary to mention the name of Galileo in order to realize that this was not always so. If, therefore, the conclusions intuitively reached from the study of the symbolical content of poems and works of fiction can be shown to be capable of arrangement in a logically coherent system which is not incompatible with other known facts, we are bound to accept them as no less true than the deductions of physicists in regard to the electron, or of economists in regard to monetary trends. And if these conclusions indicate that a great deal of human behavior is motivated by mental factors of which we are not conscious, we must accept that fact also. It is mortifying, but it is true. A fortiori, we may conclude that when a creative artist gives his fantasy free rein, he will inevitably bring to expression things which are not present in his conscious mind, of the existence of which, in fact, he is completely unaware. Consciously, he may be concerned only with the technique of his art, and with some rational theme which he wishes to communicate. But the apparently fortuitous choice of characters and situations, of words and images, may reveal a whole world of the mind which has little or no connection with the content of the writer's consciousness. The reader will be able to judge for himself whether such conclusions are justifiable. Another point concerns the approach to religious themes. Today, it is perhaps hardly necessary to apologize for free thinking in such matters. In face of the predominantly materialistic outlook of the times, the need is rather to explain an attitude which accepts any kind of divine principle as a reality. Since this question leads straight to one of the main themes of the study, it will be well to clarify it at the outset. We shall be concerned with the contrast between two worlds: the inner world which lies beyond and around the conscious mind, and the outer world which the body and other individuals form part. This distinction, which is no more and no less absolute than any other conceptual dichotomy, has been adumbrated by Jung in his differentiation between the introverted and extroverted functioning of the mind, in Wandlungen, Symbol de Libido, or the Psychology of the Unconscious. In a much later work, he also makes the distinction between factual and what he calls psychological truth. If, he says, in illustration of his thesis, it had been long universally held that the river Rhine flowed back in a circle to its source, then the idea must be held to be psychologically true, quite irrespective of its factual erroneousness, for such a notion could not be widely accepted over a long period unless it corresponded with and gave expression to some universal content or structure of the mind. If it lacked the attribute of psychological truth, it would long ago have been forgotten like any other improbable traveler's tale. The notion, in fact, represents an inner or psychological truth, The error arises only in referring it to the outer world. Factual phenomenon known as the River Rhine. There must exist, in order to account for the existence of the legend, an abstract type or mental image of a river which returns to its source, and this may be held to exist objectively if it is found to occur independently in a number of human minds at different times and places. The fact that no concrete material river has ever been known to conform to such a picture by no means invalidates the objective existence of the image. On the contrary, it tends to substantiate it. For we must ask ourselves how it then comes about that so many people have for so long shown a disposition to believe anything so incompatible with the characteristics of the outer world which they know. The same consideration applies to religious legends. They are necessarily true in the psychological and inner world sense, by virtue of the fact that they have at some time exerted a fascination over the minds of men, and have, incidentally, thereby changed the course of history. Like in international treaties, a business contract, or an act of parliament, they produce consequences which affect our lives, although they exist only on paper, or, in other words, in our minds. Therefore, we can deny them neither truth nor reality. The question of their historical or factual truth is quite another matter, and from the inner point of view completely immaterial. We cannot, as Jung points out, prove that the events described in the Gospels, or for that matter in the Edda, the Quran, or the Vedantas, did not occur as historical facts. All that we can say is that it is highly improbable. But even if the negative proof were available, it would not alter the psychological truth of the stories. So far as Christianity is concerned, we must learn to distinguish between the inner image of the Christ and the historical character, or possibly characters, called Jeshu or something similar, who once caused a disturbance in Palestine. Whoever the latter may have been, and whatever he or they may have done, the image of the Redeemer exists, and has always existed, as a living force in the human mind. And, incidentally, no vegetation myth is required to account for it, or can account for it. The virgin birth, the crucifixion, and the resurrection are all psychological truths which have found symbolical expression again and again throughout history, and which are still being revealed in the creative works of the present day. This viewpoint, which will be elaborated in the course of the study, is surely not incompatible with a proper reverence for those ideas which many people still hold sacred. The idea that a story which is factually true has greater significance or importance than one which is invented is, moreover, a sign of inferior thinking. There exists an abundance of cheap magazines produced for the poorly educated, which find it worth implying by their titles that the stories contained in them are true, and superficial thinkers constantly reiterate the proverb that truth is stranger than fiction. There is here a glimmering of understanding in the contrasting natures of the two worlds, for the word strange evidently implies incredible, striking, or significant. What the proverb is really saying is that the outer world, truth, is normally less coherent, striking, and significant, and that it contains less meaning than the inner world, which is considered fiction. But that occasionally outer world events do occur whose dramatic or significant quality is so marked that it transcends the limits of outer world plausibility, which writers of fiction normally impose on themselves. We do, in fact, normally judge the interest and significance of outer world events as distinct from their practical implications, very largely by the standards of the inner world. Practical considerations apart, therefore, it is the form of the inner world in which we are really interested. It is the event which has dramatic quality, which is moving, striking, inspiring, shocking, for negative values may be no less arresting and significant than positive ones, which we single out, remember, and rejoice in telling to one another. Truth, in the sense of the record of factual events, acquires interest, practical considerations apart, in proportion to its similarity to fiction. The factual truth or untruth of a religious legend concerning events which are said to have occurred centuries ago can obviously have no practical repercussions at the present day. The wine bill for the marriage feast at Cana has been paid long since, and Lazarus is dead, whether for the first or second time is immaterial now. The only importance of the gospel stories today lies in their inner world value, in the psychological truths, not merely the ethical principles which they reveal. And that, of course, is very great. If, when we come to analyze and identify the elements of which their message is composed, we find that the same elements are embodied in other stories, and sometimes in a far less edifying form. That is, nothing for anybody either to be distressed or to crow about. The stories remain, and neither their value nor their beauty is any way lessened by such considerations. The inner world truths which they embody are realities of the mind, capable of influencing us and our actions, and are therefore no less real or true than that which we can touch or see. If their significance is universal, it is hardly to be expected that their content should be unique. Among the countless millions of human beings who have concerned themselves with human problems which are basically the same throughout the ages, a number must inevitably have discovered the same spiritual or inner world realities and have brought them to expression according to their idiom and their capacity. If some of these revelations are inferior or even objectionable, that does not detract from the value of the others. Anybody is free to maintain that the gospel stories are superior to any other versions of the same theme, and I should not join issue with him. The identity of this theme with that of the other stories, on the other hand, however inferior the latter may be in their aesthetic or ethical form, is a fact which cannot be denied and which it is an intellectual duty to insist upon. Another point to which it is as well that the reader's attention should be drawn in advance is a purely formal one. Contrary to the usual practice, I have given a brief synopsis of all the works to which I have devoted detailed consideration. In my experience, nothing is more annoying or discouraging than the assumption, so commonly met with in works of this nature, that the reader must be familiar with all the more important works of literature, or the blithe observation that the work in question is easily available for reference. No author, if he is not writing purely for specialists or professional scholars, has the right to expect his readers either have all the classics fresh in their memories, or else to devote days to the study of works which are often lengthy and diffuse, simply in order that they may be able to follow his argument. I am, of course, plainly aware of the fact that such synopses can only be grotesque travesties which are liable to give a completely distorted impression of what may be a great original. But it seems to me that this defect, regrettable though it is, must be accepted as the price of intelligibility. I can only hope that my readers will be moved to consult the originals of any of these works with which they are not familiar, and that my dissection of them will not prevent their finding the same pleasure and inspiration in them that I have found. I have adopted the same principle with regard to the works of Jung. His system represents advances in thought in spheres far wider than that of medical psychology, and it is not always easy of assimilation. His various theories, moreover, are scattered among a considerable number of works, some of which are not easy reading, and those who do not read German will find that the quality of the earlier translations into English leaves very much to be desired. The translation of the new complete edition of Jung's work in English, now in course of publication, is on the other hand admirable. I have therefore acted on the assumption that it would not be safe to presume any great familiarity with his system in the average reader, for few people in these days have the time or enjoy the tranquility necessary to master such a considerable body of work. Accordingly, I have done my best to provide summaries of the main heads of his system, piecemeal as they arise, by presenting them thus separately in the context of the examples to which they apply. I hope that I have made what others, or might otherwise, might, or be an, I should restart. By presenting them thus separately in the context of the examples to which they apply, I hope that I have made what might otherwise be an indigestible body of condensed theory somewhat more readable. Those to whom Jung's system is already familiar will be able to skip these interpolations. For others, I hope that they will provide an elementary introduction which may inspire a study of the originals. This volume is part of a larger whole, which I hope to publish under the general title A Study of Two Worlds. I have attempted to make it self-contained, but at the same time to embody it in an adumbration of the scope of the whole study. And so that's the introduction, and I'm going to read each chapter over the next few posts, since there's really not much to read. They were when I started using, or just like, I guess starting to read video, or make videos and Liber readings. But yeah, it's going to be a big task to also read The Ancient Secret, but I really do want to read that and have that available. But yeah, I don't know, I didn't know what else to have like as a visualization while reading that. But anyway, that was fun.